by differentiating 5 criminal classes. Born criminal, insane criminal, criminal by passion, habitual criminal, and the occasional criminal. In other words, there are those that are born that way, and those who become that way. Personality, character, far outweigh the presence of psychotic or defective diagnoses. In other words, by extrapolation, are criminals born? Or are they formed?
Mindhunter is set in the late 1970s and explores the early days of the FBI's behavioral science unit. The show focuses on FBI agents Holden Ford and Bill Tench as they pioneer criminal psychology and criminal profiling, interviewing notorious serial killers to understand their mindset. In this video, we'll talk about the most notorious serial killers featured in the show and analyze their motives.
That's when I started burying the heads in the backyard. Right underneath Mom's bedroom window. Their faces looking right up at her window when she was at home. Right under her nose, man. Couldn't help myself. And mentally.
The first featured serial killer was Ed Kemper. Ed Kemper, known as the co-ed killer, was a real-life serial killer who murdered 10 people, including his grandparents and his own mother, between 1964 and 1973. He is notorious for his highly intelligent and articulate demeanor, which contrasts sharply with the brutal nature of his crimes. Kemper dismembered and sexually assaulted his victims after killing them, and his actions were driven by deep-seated issues with women, particularly his mother, whom he despised. Kemper becomes a kind of teacher to the agents, especially Ford, who grows fascinated by the killer's ability to explain the underlying psychology of his actions. Kemper provides insights into his childhood, his feelings toward his domineering mother, and how those emotions drove him to kill. Unlike many serial killers who deny or downplay their actions, Kemper openly admits to the brutal murders, explaining his thought processes with an unsettling level of calmness and intelligence. The other serial killer was the BTK killer. The BTK killer, Dennis Rader, was a real-life serial killer who murdered 10 people between 1974 and 1991 in Wichita, Kansas. He earned his nickname from the sadistic methods he used to bind, torture, and kill his victims. Rader led a double life. He was an active member of his community, a church leader, and a seemingly ordinary family man. His ability to blend into suburban life while committing heinous crimes made him one of the most elusive and chilling killers in American history. He wasn't caught until 2005, after sending taunting letters to the police and media, which eventually led to his capture. Rader's compulsion to bind, torture, and kill reflects his need for complete dominance and control over his victims. His carefully planned rituals and fantasies are driven by a desire to assert absolute control, making him one of the most sadistic and methodical killers featured in Mindhunter. Rader's sexual deviances are explored through his private rituals and fantasies, connecting him to the broader theme of the show, how certain sexual fantasies or fetishes can escalate into violent, criminal behavior. His obsession with bondage, control, and sadomasochism mirrors some of the traits seen in other killers interviewed by Ford and Tench, but his double life as a family man makes him even more unsettling.
Prison's in your mind. How do you feel about those murders? That's what counts. Happened in your world, not in mine.
Charles Manson was the infamous leader of the Manson family, a cult that committed a series of brutal murders in 1969. The most notorious of these killings was the murder of actress Sharon Tate and several others at her home in Los Angeles. Manson, though not directly involved in the killings, masterminded the crimes by manipulating his followers into carrying out the murders on his behalf. He was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, largely due to his role as the charismatic and manipulative leader of the Manson family. Manson believed in a race war he called helter-skelter, which he thought he could incite through his followers' violent acts. He remains one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history, both for his crimes and his disturbing ability to control and manipulate people. Manson tries to deflect blame, claiming that he didn't personally kill anyone and that his followers acted on their own accord. His ability to shift the narrative and place responsibility on others is a key aspect of his personality that the agents focus on. The agents are particularly interested in how Manson was able to control his followers, turning them into willing participants in horrific acts of violence. Manson explains that he never forced anyone to do anything, but his skill in manipulating vulnerable individuals into committing murder reveals his deep understanding of psychological control. His case is an example of how leaders can manipulate people into committing acts of violence, not through direct orders, but through emotional and psychological manipulation. During the interview, Manson touches on his helter-skelter philosophy, his belief in an impending race war, and how he thought his crimes would help trigger it. His apocalyptic vision and distorted sense of reality highlight his deep delusions, yet his ability to make his followers believe in these ideas emphasizes the dangerous power of charismatic leadership. Ford and Tench see Manson as an example of a criminal driven by ideological and delusional beliefs, which sets him apart from the serial killers they typically study. Manson repeatedly insists that he is not to blame for the murders, claiming his followers acted of their own volition. He portrays himself as a victim of society, weaving a narrative of persecution that helped him justify his actions. His refusal to accept responsibility is a stark reminder of his manipulative nature and his skill in controlling how others perceive him. Other serial killers featured include Monty Ralph Russell, who was a real-life serial killer and rapist who was convicted of killing 5 women in the 1970s. He committed his first rape at the age of 14 and escalated to murder shortly after being released from prison at age 18. His victims were women, and his attacks were marked by sexual violence, often following a pattern of rape before murder. He was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Russell is portrayed as a sullen, emotionally detached individual who appears less articulate and insightful than other killers the FBI agents interview, such as Ed Kemper. His lack of remorse and casual attitude toward his horrific crimes create a disturbing atmosphere during his scenes. However, the agents manage to extract key information from him that sheds light on his motivations and psychological state. During the interview, Russell reveals that his killing spree was triggered by rejection. After his girlfriend broke up with him, Russell became consumed by anger, which he projected onto his victims. This theme of rejection leading to violence is a common thread in the psychological profiles of many serial killers. Russell's complete lack of remorse or empathy for his victims is one of the most chilling aspects of his character. When asked about his crimes, he describes them with a matter-of-fact tone, showing no guilt or emotional connection to the people he killed. Russell helps the agents understand the patterns in a serial killer's behavior, particularly how rapists can evolve into murderers. He reveals that in some cases, he let his victims go if they cooperated, while in other cases, he killed them because they resisted. His ability to turn off his violent tendencies depending on his mood or the victim's actions gives Ford and Tench insight into the unpredictability of such criminals. Russell's absence of guilt or empathy illustrates one of the fundamental characteristics of psychopathic killers. He doesn't see his victims as individuals, but rather as extensions of his own frustrations and anger, making him a prime example for the FBI's study. Jerome Henry Brudos, also known as the Lust Killer, was a real-life American serial killer and necrophile who murdered at least 4 women in Oregon between 1968 and 1969. Brudos had a deep-seated fetish for women's shoes and clothing, which began in childhood and escalated into violent sexual fantasies as he grew older. He was known for stealing women's shoes and undergarments and later murdering women to fulfill his sexual fantasies, including dressing them in these items after death and photographing their bodies. He kept body parts, such as severed feet, as trophies. Brudos is portrayed as a calm, unrepentant killer who takes pleasure in recounting his violent acts during his interview with Ford and Tench. Unlike some of the other killers interviewed, Brudos is less cooperative and more hostile, yet his willingness to discuss his crimes in detail helps the agents explore the connections between sexual fetishes and violent behavior. Brudos explains his obsession with women's shoes and how it began at a young age. This fetish grew into a violent compulsion, eventually leading him to murder women, so he could take their shoes and clothing for his own sexual gratification. The interview provides Ford and Tench with critical insight into how certain paraphilias, abnormal sexual desires, can evolve into violent criminal behavior. Brudos' deep hatred and objectification of women are evident in his behavior and demeanor. He dehumanizes his victims, seeing them merely as objects to fulfill his fantasies rather than as people. His misogyny, combined with his sexual deviance, serves as a case study for the agents on how killers like Brudos use violence to dominate and control women. He relishes talking about his crimes and seems to enjoy the attention. His narcissism is evident in the way he talks about his victims, as if they exist solely for his gratification. Brudos' tendency to take trophies from his victims, such as their shoes and even body parts, shows how killers often escalate from fantasy to action and how they relive their crimes through these objects. His obsession with these trophies reflects his need to control and possess his victims even after their deaths, another key behavioral trait the agents examine in their profiling work. Holden Ford, who is always eager to understand the psychology of killers, is particularly intrigued by Brutto's fetishistic motivations. He sees Brutto's as an example of how a seemingly innocuous obsession, like a fetish for women's shoes, can evolve into violent behavior when paired with deeper psychological issues like misogyny and a desire for control.